Bianca laughed across the Christmas table. 32 and still single. Must be tough spending the holidays all alone. I set down my fork and replied softly, "Don't worry about me. I have been married for 2 years. And my husband can freeze every single dime of the project Grant is pitching right now." They erupted in laughter, assuming I was lying. They had no idea I was simply waiting to sink their fragile ship. I am Penelope Ramirez. To understand the sheer absurdity of the scene unfolding around me, you first have to understand the dining room of my parents, Elena and Rafael Ramirez. Situated in one of the most painfully affluent suburbs of Chicago, the room was a monument to their desperate need for validation. A custom mahogany table stretched across the floor, groaning under the weight of a feast that looked more like a curated magazine spread than a family meal. Crystal wine glasses caught the light of a chandelier that cost more than my first car, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive pine, and the suffocating pressure of unstated expectations. This was the Ramirez family Christmas. On the surface, it was a postcard of generational success and warmth. Beneath that heavily polished veneer, it was a toxic ecosystem built on a rigid hierarchy, and I was firmly positioned at the very bottom. The evening had been proceeding exactly as it always did. My mother was subtly critiquing my choice of a simple black dress. My father was pouring vintage wine while boasting about his golf handicap, and my younger sister, Bianca, was holding court. Bianca was the undisputed golden child, a woman who had spun a superficial existence of parties, designer clothes, and carefully curated social media posts into an identity. As the main course was cleared, my father raised his glass for the traditional holiday toast. The room quieted. This was Bianca's favorite moment to strike. She waited until every eye was fixed on the head of the table, until the silence was perfectly primed, and then she turned her perfectly contoured face toward me. She let out a bright, ringing laugh, designed to carry across the length of the long mahogany table. 32 and still single. It really must be tough spending the holidays all alone, Penelope, especially at your age. We all worry about you. Sitting in that old house by yourself? The table erupted in a collective, pitying chuckle. My mother sighed a theatrical sigh of maternal concern, while my father gave a tight, embarrassed smile. They loved this narrative, the tragic, lonely older sister, a foil to Bianca's radiant perfection. I did not flush. I did not drop my gaze. I simply set down my silver fork, picked up my linen napkin, and gently blotted the corner of my mouth. The fabric was cool against my skin. I looked directly into Bianca's triumphant eyes. "Do not worry about me, Bianca," I replied, my voice dangerously soft, yet clear enough to cut through the lingering laughter. "I have been married for 2 years, and my husband is the man who can freeze every single dime of the project your husband is pitching to this family right now." For exactly 1 second, the dining room was completely silent. The heavy crystal glasses hovered in midair. Then, the laughter returned, doubling in volume and cruelty. It was not the nervous laughter of people who had been caught off guard. It was the booming, condescending laughter of a family that believed I had finally cracked under the pressure of my own pathetic existence. My mother reached across the table, her rings flashing, and patted my hand with aggressive sympathy. "Oh, Penelope, there is no need to make up such wild stories just because you feel left out. We love you exactly as you are, even if you are a bit behind your sister." I did not argue. I let them have their moment of supreme superiority. It was entirely logical for them to assume I was lying. For years, I had maintained a fortress of privacy around my personal life. I never brought a date to their suffocating dinners. I never shared details of my weekends. I had learned early on that giving this family any information was akin to handing them loaded ammunition. So, when I married Rowan 2 years ago in a quiet, private civil ceremony, I told absolutely no one. I kept my maiden name professionally and socially. There were no engagement rings flaunted at Thanksgiving, no wedding photos for Bianca to critique, no opportunity for my parents to turn my marriage into a networking event. "Well, speaking of projects and actual success," Grant Holloway interrupted, sliding smoothly into the conversation to rescue the mood and, more importantly, to redirect the spotlight back onto himself. Grant was Bianca's husband, a man whose entire personality was constructed from buzzwords, tailored Italian suits, and the kind of unearned confidence that my parents found absolutely intoxicating. Grant offered the table a generous, gleaming smile. "Let us focus on the future. I brought something to show everyone. A little sneak peek into what is going to redefine this family's legacy." He reached into his leather briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a stack of thick, heavy stock folders. He began passing them around the table like a king distributing land grants. He was playing the role of the visionary, the successful star of the family. "This is Wintermere Exchange," Grant announced, his voice vibrating with practiced enthusiasm. "It is not just a real estate development. We are taking the entire historic district and transforming it into a luxury winter festival and high-end retail paradise. Millions in projected revenue, exclusive boutiques, ice rinks, five-star hospitality. And we are launching it on New Year's Eve." A murmur of awe swept through the family. Even my father leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses to study the documents. Bianca looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unfiltered greed disguised as devotion. A folder landed in front of me. The cover was deep navy blue, stamped with heavy gold foil lettering. Inside were glossy architectural renderings showing snow-covered cobblestone streets illuminated by fairy lights, alongside heavy embossed VIP invitations for a New Year's Eve launch gala. "Go ahead. Penelope, take a look," Grant sneered from across the table, taking a slow sip of his wine. "It is a bit more complex than the municipal compliance checklists you push around at your desk, but try to keep up. It is good to see how real wealth is built." I ignored his taunt. My eyes were not on the pretty pictures or the gold foil. As a senior director of municipal compliance, my brain was permanently wired to look past the marketing and search for the structural integrity of the paper trail. I flipped past the glossy renderings and stopped at the back pocket of the folder, which contained a sheet summarizing the project's financial backing, a document clearly meant to impress potential private investors at this table. My eyes scanned the columns of projected returns and equity stakes, landing on a small, alphanumeric string printed at the bottom corner of a funding authorization summary. It was an escrow routing code. The air in my lungs turned instantly to ice. The code belonged to Black Pine Trust. It was the specific institutional prefix used for their high-tier protective receivership accounts. I knew this with absolute certainty because Black Pine Trust was the financial management firm operated by my husband, Rowan. But that was not the problem. The problem was that this specific type of routing code was strictly back-end. It was highly classified internal data used solely by clearinghouse managers to lock funds in dispute. It was never, under any circumstances, meant to be printed on a forward-facing investor marketing brochure, let alone one being passed around a dining table next to the cranberry sauce. For that code to be on this paper, the normal protocols had to have been bypassed. It meant Grant had not just exaggerated his connections or embellished his projections. He had actively breached a secure data environment or acquired forged documents mirroring a closed system. He was waving around a piece of paper that tied him directly to fraudulent access of a trust managed by a man who possessed the power to destroy him with a single phone call. I looked up from the brochure. Grant was still talking, his hands moving expansively as he painted a picture of infinite wealth, drawing my parents and extended family deeper into his illusion. Bianca was nodding along, already calculating how many designer bags this imaginary empire would buy her. They were so arrogant, so blindly, blissfully arrogant. In that exact fraction of a second, the dynamic of the entire room shifted, though I was the only one who felt it. The anger that had threatened to rise in my chest dissolved into a sharp, crystalline focus. Grant Holloway was not just a bragging, obnoxious brother-in-law. He was a thief walking blindly into a minefield, holding a map he did not know how to read. I closed the navy blue folder, running my thumb over the smooth, expensive paper. I did not say another word about my marriage. I did not defend my life or my choices. I simply sat back in my chair, picked up my wineglass, and watched them continue to build their beautiful, fragile ship, knowing exactly when and how I was going to send it straight to the bottom of the ocean. To survive in my family, I had to become an auditor of human behavior long before I made it my profession. At 32 years of age, I hold the title of Senior Director of Municipal Compliance at Alder and Crest Advisory. My firm does not build things. We tear them apart. We are a specialized auditing consultancy dedicated to stripping the camouflage off fraudulent urban redevelopment projects. My daily existence revolves around dissecting the anatomy of shell companies, peeling back layers of municipal permits, zoning variances, and financial disclosures to expose the rot hiding beneath the drywall. I hunt down the exact kind of financial predators who dress themselves up in bespoke suits and million-dollar smiles. I track missing thousands, phantom contractors, and manipulated land appraisals. It is meticulous, unglamorous, and deeply cynical work. Naturally, my parents have always found my career profoundly embarrassing, treating it as a bizarre, unfeminine hobby rather than the high-stakes corporate warfare it truly is. Since childhood, the narrative inside the Ramirez household was etched in stone. I was designated the dry, unapproachable daughter who lacked the fundamental capacity to enjoy life. I was the one who read municipal zoning codes instead of fashion magazines, the one who asked too many uncomfortable questions at the dinner table, the one who refused to perform for their approval. Bianca, on the other hand, was the radiant jewel. She was raised on a steady, intoxicating diet of unearned praise and material indulgence. Over the years, she had successfully weaponized that upbringing, constructing a superficial personal brand built entirely on high society aesthetics, exclusive parties, and the desperate curation of a life that looked expensive on a digital screen. She spent thousands of dollars on garments worn for exactly 2 hours just to capture the perfect photograph. Her existence was a meticulously staged performance, and my parents were her most dedicated, unquestioning audience, willingly paying the exorbitant production costs while demanding I clap along. When Grant Holloway entered the picture, it was as if my parents had custom-ordered a son-in-law from a catalog of American excess. He possessed exactly the kind of polished articulation and impeccable tailoring that the Ramirez family worshipped. Grant did not just speak, he pitched. He had a terrifying talent for weaving narratives so grand and intoxicating that his listeners would eagerly, almost gratefully, ignore the glaring logical sinkholes in his business models. He knew how to order the most expensive bottle of scotch, how to drop the names of city aldermen with casual arrogance, and how to make my father feel like a titan of industry by merely sitting next to him. Grant was a mirror reflecting my family's deepest desires back at them, confirming their belief that they belonged among the absolute elite. They adored him for it. I saw right through him from the moment he first shook my hand, recognizing the familiar, metallic scent of a man who built empires on quicksand. My refusal to participate in their collective delusion was precisely why I had secured the most important part of my life far away from their grasping hands. 2 years ago, on a quiet, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, I married Rowan Mercer. There was no grand cathedral booked 12 months in advance, no guest list dripping with strategic social connections, and absolutely no photographs uploaded to the internet for public consumption. We exchanged our vows in a sterile civil registry office, witnessed only by a bored clerk and the profound sense of safety we found in each other's eyes. Afterward, we shared 2 cups of black coffee at a corner diner, and it was the most luxurious celebration I had ever experienced. I kept the marriage entirely concealed because I knew exactly what my family would do to it. They would have dissected Rowan, measured his quiet, solid worth against Grant's flashy, hollow illusions, and tried to turn my sanctuary into a competitive arena. Furthermore, the timing required absolute discretion. During that period, Rowan was knee-deep in restructuring highly sensitive portfolios involving distressed urban assets. His work demanded a veil of total invisibility, a professional requirement that perfectly aligned with my desperate need to protect the only beautiful, untainted thing I had ever truly claimed for myself. To my family, my silence was proof of my pathetic, solitary existence, To me, it was impenetrable armor. Yet, the most valuable tangible asset in my possession was not the simple gold band hidden on a delicate chain beneath my blouse. It was Marisol House, left to me by my maternal grandmother. It was a modest, weathering two-story brick building clutching the edge of the city's historic district. The ground floor still held the faded canvas awnings and the lingering, ghostly scent of vanilla and burnt sugar from her old bakery, while the upstairs apartment remained exactly as she had left it, filled with heavy wooden furniture and memories of a woman who actually knew how to love without conditions. To my parents, it was an eyesore, a piece of working-class history they were desperate to erase from their upwardly mobile trajectory. To me, it was the only place in the world where I had ever felt entirely safe. And by a cruel twist of geographical fate, Marisol House sat exactly adjacent to the sprawling acreage Grant was currently attempting to swallow whole. My grandmother's little brick fortress was the jagged piece of the puzzle that adamantly refused to fit into his seamless winter paradise. It shared a critical property line with the proposed main plaza of his development. Over the past 18 months, Grant had mounted a relentless, escalating campaign to pry the deed from my fingers. He started with patronizing, lowball cash offers, calling my office multiple times a week, framing his bids as a generous favor to relieve me of a property tax burden. When I flatly declined, he pivoted to suggesting a 99-year commercial lease, attempting to bury me in thick stacks of legalese. Then came the aggressive, thinly veiled demands for an easement, insisting he needed the right to bulldoze my side alley to create a service entrance for his imaginary valet parking structure. His most recent tactic, deployed just 3 weeks before the holidays, was a sleek, legally dubious proposal offering me future equity shares in his development company in exchange for the title. Odd. He genuinely believed I was foolish enough to trade solid, historic brick for monopoly money printed on his letterhead. I rejected every single proposal, not just out of fierce sentimental devotion, but because my professional training allowed me to read the lethal fine print hiding in his contracts. I understood the sheer legal leverage of holding the anchor property. I knew that surrendering Marisol House meant watching my grandmother's legacy be paved over to make room for a garbage loading dock serving an empire of lies. They all thought they could break my resolve through sheer attrition, completely unaware that they were trying to erode a mountain with a garden hose. My silence was never submission. It was the quiet calculation of a woman waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clinking of silver dessert spoons against delicate porcelain signaled the final, most dangerous phase of the evening. Slices of an overly complex poached pear tart were being distributed by the catering staff my mother had hired to pretend she cooked. I was just lifting my espresso cup when a thick cream-colored manila folder landed on the mahogany table with a heavy thud, missing my saucer by a fraction of an inch. Grant leaned back in his chair, adjusting his silk tie with a practiced air of casual dominance. "That is the community alignment packet," he announced, projecting his voice so my father at the far end of the table would not miss a single syllable. "We are finalizing the local stakeholder endorsements. It is just a standard procedural hurdle. I need your signature on the last page. Penelope." It shows the zoning board that the adjacent property owners are fully on board with the Urban Renewal Initiative. My mother, Elena, immediately ceased chewing her tart. Her eyes darted from Grant to the folder, then locked onto me with a laser-focused intensity. "It is just one signature, Penelope," she urged, her tone dripping with that suffocating blend of maternal pleading and an absolute command. "You work in this exact industry. You know how these things go. Signing a piece of paper to help your family is a microscopic effort for you, but it means everything for Grant's timeline. This project is going to elevate the Ramirez name to a completely new tier in this city." I did not respond to her. My silence was a trained reflex. I pulled the heavy folder toward me and opened the cover. I did not read it like a sister-in-law or a cooperative neighbor. I read it like the senior auditor I was. My eyes bypassed the glossy mission statements and the hollow corporate jargon, scanning directly for the structural load-bearing data points of the contract. It took me less than 45 seconds to find the rot. On page 12, Under the preliminary funding authorizations, the disbursement code listed was not a finalized routing sequence. It was a holding integer, completely unapproved for public-facing stakeholder documents. On page 24, the municipal permit tracking numbers were formatted using a sequential alphanumeric pattern that the City Planning Office had officially phased out 3 years ago. Worst of all, the digital notary seal stamped at the bottom of the environmental impact summary was heavily pixelated around the borders. It was a clumsy, desperate copy-and-paste job stolen from a legitimate document to make this packet look official to the untrained eye. But the true horror was buried in the supplementary infrastructure overlay on page 40. It was a topographical map detailing the service routes for Wintermere Exchange. My grandmother's property, Marisol House, was not designated as an adjacent, independent lot. Grant had it color-coded in industrial gray, labeled as Service Sector B. He had mapped out a multi-level valet parking structure and a commercial waste routing zone directly over the footprint of my property. He had submitted these preliminary schematics to his investors and the city as if the acquisition was already a finalized legal fact. He had cannibalized my home on paper, banking on bullying me into submission before anyone double-checked the property deeds. I closed the folder. I aligned the edges perfectly with the edge of the table. I looked up at Grant, keeping my facial muscles entirely relaxed and my voice stripped of any emotional resonance. "I am not signing this," I said quietly. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. My father dropped his spoon. My mother let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, pressing her hand against her chest as if I had just declared a physical assault. Bianca slammed her hands on the table, the dark red wine in her glass violently sloshing over the crystal rim. "You are unbelievable!" she shrieked, her carefully curated elegance evaporating into pure, unfiltered venom. "You just cannot stand it, can you? You cannot stand that I am happy, that I have a successful husband, that we are building something massive while you sit in a dusty old bakery doing absolutely nothing with your life. You are so suffocated by your own jealousy that you would actively sabotage your own family just to drag us down to your miserable level." "It has nothing to do with jealousy, Bianca," I replied evenly. "The documentation is structurally flawed. I will not attach my professional name or my property to it." "You are just bitter," my mother interjected, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You have always been this way, Penelope. Always difficult, always looking for a reason to ruin a beautiful evening." I stood up, picked up my wool coat from the back of the chair, and walked out of the dining room without another word. Engaging with their collective hysteria was a losing game. I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound porch, the freezing Chicago wind immediately biting through my thin dress, a welcome shock to my system after the suffocating heat of that dining room. The heavy oak front door swung open behind me. Bianca marched out, her arms crossed tight against the cold. She cornered me near the stone steps, her eyes narrowed into dark slits. "You think you are so superior," Bianca hissed, dropping the volume but increasing the malice. "But you are just pathetic. Only a deeply bitter, damaged woman clings to a rotting, worthless bakery like it is her entire personality. You are terrified of moving forward, so you want to make sure everyone else stays stuck in the mud with you. Keep your stupid little house. Nobody cares about you anyway." She spun around and marched back inside. Before the door could fully latch, Grant pushed his way out. He did not possess his wife's fiery, emotional rage. He carried the cold, calculated menace of a man who believed he owned the world and everyone in it. He walked slowly toward me, stopping just inches away, invading my physical space in a textbook intimidation tactic. His polished veneer was completely gone, replaced by something ugly and desperate. "Let us get one thing perfectly straight, Penelope," Grant said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You are not going to hold up a multi-million-dollar development over a pile of worthless bricks. If you do not sign that alignment packet and cooperate with the easement transfers by the end of the week, I will personally see to it that you regret it. I play golf with the head of the zoning board. I can have Marisol House redlined as a structural hazard so fast you will not be able to sell it for scrap metal." The city will condemn it, and I will buy it from the municipality for pennies. He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive scotch heavy on his breath. And do not think your little corporate job makes you untouchable. I know people in the compliance sector. I can arrange for enough anonymous ethics complaints to be filed against you to keep your license suspended and your name buried in litigation for the next 10 years. You will be toxic. Unemployable. Sign the paper. Penelope, do not be stupid. I looked him dead in the eye, offering absolutely nothing, no fear, no anger, no compliance. I turned on my heel, walked down the stone steps, and got into my car. The engine roared to life, the heater instantly blasting warm air against my frozen hands. I pulled out of the sprawling driveway, leaving the glowing mansion behind me. The dark but quiet roads of the suburb offered a brief sanctuary. 2 miles down the highway, my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. The caller ID flashed a single name. Rowan. Are you out of the house? His voice filled the cabin, a deep, steady anchor in the chaotic aftermath of the evening. I am driving back now, I answered, keeping my eyes on the icy road. Grant made his move. He tried to force me to sign a community alignment packet. He already mapped Marisol House into his service infrastructure. I figured as much, Rowan replied, the professional edge sharpening his tone. Penelope, I need you to listen carefully. The Black Pine Trust internal security matrix just tripped a priority 1 alert about 20 minutes ago. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What kind of alert? An unauthorized external mirroring attempt, Rowan explained, the sound of rapid typing echoing faintly in the background. Someone tried to duplicate a secure access token, and the alphanumeric string they used to try and bypass the firewall? It is the exact same escrow routing code Grant had printed on that glossy marketing brochure you told me about earlier. The trap was not just set. The prey was actively trying to chew through the lock. Grant was not merely boasting. He was actively attempting to siphon funds he had absolutely no right to touch. Using stolen credentials he barely understood. He is getting desperate, I said, the cold logic taking over. He needs that initial disbursement to keep the shell game going, and he thinks he can force the lock. He just flagged his own location to federal-level security monitors, Rowan said softly. Drive safe, Penelope. We have a lot of work to do tonight. I disconnected the call. The tension in my shoulders began to shift, transforming from defensive exhaustion into a lethal, focused energy. Grant Holloway thought he had backed me into a corner, threatening my home and my livelihood. He had no idea he had just handed me the very rope I was going to use to hang him. The relentless vibration against the mahogany nightstand began at exactly 6 a.m. By the time I walked into the kitchen and poured my first cup of black coffee, the screen displayed 72 unread notifications, all stemming from the extended family group chat. The digital onslaught had begun. I unlocked the device and scrolled through the barrage. Bianca had apparently stayed up half the night curating a targeted smear campaign. She had uploaded a series of candid, unflattering photographs taken during the dinner, specifically choosing angles where I looked entirely isolated and miserable at the edge of the table. Beneath the images was a massive block of text, crafted with the sickly sweet, passive-aggressive tone of someone pretending to be concerned. She wrote that I was clearly suffering from severe psychological distress. She claimed my announcement about being married was a desperate, fabricated delusion designed to save face because I simply could not handle seeing her and Grant so successful and deeply in love. She urged the aunts, uncles, and cousins to pray for my mental health, framing my refusal to sign the alignment packet as an act of pure, unhinged sabotage born out of a pathetic, lonely existence. The replies from the extended family were pouring in, pitying emojis, offers of therapist recommendations, complete and unquestioning agreement with Bianca. They were burying me alive in the digital town square, and they were enjoying every single second of it. Before I could even set the phone down, the screen flashed with an incoming call. It was my mother. I answered, keeping the device pressed flat against my ear. Her voice lacked any of the performative warmth from the previous evening. It was sharp, brittle, and strictly transactional. She told me to stop throwing a childish tantrum. She insisted that all I needed to do was drive to Grant's office, sign the zoning support documentation, and officially transfer the alley easement for my grandmother's property. If I did that, she promised, the entire family would graciously agree to forget my embarrassing little outburst about a fake husband, and all misunderstandings would be immediately swept under the rug. "I am not signing anything," I stated, my voice dead calm. "And you should be looking very closely at what your son-in-law is actually doing." There was a scuffle on the other end of the line. The phone was snatched away, and my father's heavy, ragged breathing filled the speaker. He sounded terrified, a stark contrast to the arrogant patriarch who had poured vintage wine just 12 hours prior. He yelled at me to stop playing compliance officer with their lives. He lost control of his temper, and in his blind panic, he let the truth slip. He screamed that he had completely refinanced their estate, pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity out of the family home to act as a primary seed investor for Wintermere Exchange. The kitchen suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. My parents were not just naive cheerleaders anymore. They had willingly strapped themselves to a sinking ship. Grant had used their desperate need for status to drain their actual assets. When I did not immediately respond, my father took my silence as a weakness. He lowered his voice, delivering a threat he had clearly rehearsed with my mother. If I continued to block the development, they would hire a legal team to officially contest my grandmother's will. They would go to a probate judge and testify that I had exerted undue mental influence over a sick, elderly woman to secure the deed to Marisol House for myself. They were willing to perjure themselves and destroy my grandmother's memory just to force my hand. I ended the call without a word. My own parents were fully prepared to rip me apart to protect a fraud. I walked down the hallway to the secure home office. Rowan was already at his desk. Multiple encrypted monitors cast a pale blue glow across his face. He had been working since he called me from the car last night. The sleek, dangerous infrastructure of his trust management firm was fully mobilized. I stood behind his chair, resting my hands on his shoulders. He reached up, his fingers briefly tightening over mine in a silent gesture of solidarity, before pointing to the center screen. "My technical team finished tracing the unauthorized access attempt from last night," Rowan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The mirrored token originated from a dynamic IP address, but they failed to mask the hardware layer. It bounced right back to a laptop registered to Grant's personal assistant. So Grant did not even do the dirty work himself," I noted, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of data. "He made his assistant clone the escrow routing code." "Exactly," Rowan confirmed, "but that is just the surface. Once we had the hardware footprint, we ran a reverse audit on the outbound communications linked to that machine over the past 90 days. We hit a massive cluster of shell operations." Rowan tapped a key, bringing up a complex financial flowchart. It detailed a web of subcontractors supposedly hired for Wintermere Exchange. There were invoices for architectural preservation, soil testing, and historical masonry restoration. "We pulled the state registry data on these vendors," Rowan continued. "None of them have physical equipment. None of them have actual payroll records. They are ghost contractors, mailbox drops registered in Delaware and Nevada. Grant is generating fake invoices for services that do not exist, and using those invoices to bleed the initial investor capital dry." I leaned closer to the monitor. This was my territory. I understood the mechanics of this theft intimately. He was inflating the operational budget with phantom expenses, pocketing the difference, and desperately trying to unlock the escrow to cover the massive holes he was creating in his own ledger. "Wait," I said, pointing to a specific routing line near the bottom of the schematic. "Pull up the ledger for the structural branding consultant." Rowan isolated the file. The screen populated with a series of scheduled wire transfers. Every single month, $35,000 was being funneled from one of the primary ghost contractors directly into a private media agency account. The agency was listed under a corporate limited liability company, but the registered agent name was clear as day. It was Bianca, The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The relentless social media posts, the aggressive defense of Grant's honor, the venomous attacks against my character, and the manic desperation to keep the illusion alive. I had spent the entire morning assuming Bianca was merely a vapid, ignorant pawn, blinded by her husband's shiny promises and her own desperate need for luxury. But looking at the digital paper trail of dirty money flowing directly into her personal accounts, the truth was far more sinister. She might not have known the intricate legal mechanics of the escrow fraud or the forged municipal permits, but she absolutely knew she was being paid exorbitant amounts of money from a hidden secondary source tied to the project. She was being compensated to act as the glamorous, aggressive shield for the operation. She was eating the poisonous fruit and violently attacking anyone who dared to look at the roots of the tree. My sister was not a victim of Grant's manipulation. She was on the payroll. "She is taking a cut," I whispered, the reality settling heavily into my bones. "She is taking stolen money disguised as consulting fees to fund her lifestyle. That is why she is trying to destroy my reputation today. If I stop the project, her personal cash flow shuts down." Rowan turned his chair to face me. His expression was unreadable, the face of a man who managed billions of dollars in hostile environments, but his eyes were entirely focused on me. "They threatened your home, your career, and your sanity today. Your parents are leveraged to the hilt, and your sister is an active accomplice. The trap is closing." I stood up straight, feeling a sudden, strange sense of liberation. When the people you are supposed to love remove all the rules of engagement, it frees you to do exactly the same. They thought they were hunting a frightened, lonely woman. They had no idea they had just cornered an apex predator in her own domain. "Let them close the trap," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "We are going to let them build their beautiful, fraudulent empire all the way up to the sky. And then, we are going to cut the pillars right out from under them." The 72 hours following Christmas Day were a blur of encrypted servers, legal counsel, and the sterile hum of processing towers. Outside, a picturesque blanket of snow covered the city, a perfect holiday illusion that mirrored the pristine facade my family desperately tried to project. Inside our home, Rowan and I turned the secure office into a war room. His legal and technical teams operated remotely, acting as the precise scalpels we used to dissect the rotting corpse of Wintermere Exchange. We bypassed the glossy surface of Grant's promises and dug straight into the bedrock of his financial filings: wire transfer histories, preferential tax documents, architectural preservation vouchers, and the entire logistical chain of subcontractor payments. The anatomy of the fraud was beautifully arrogant, built on the assumption that no one would ever dare to look beneath the floorboards. Grant was exploiting a massive federal historic preservation tax incentive. To qualify for those lucrative government credits, he had to prove to the municipality that he was painstakingly restoring the original masonry and structural integrity of the historic district. We cross-referenced his submitted ledgers with the actual disbursement logs and found the fatal discrepancy. He was inflating the restoration costs by over 300%. He had fabricated an entire network of dummy restoration firms, generating counterfeit invoices for artisan millwork, structural reinforcement, and material sourcing that was never actually performed. Every time a forged invoice was filed, Grant initiated a draw request, siphoning the cash out of the investor pool in carefully measured tranches. He was literally billing his own investors for phantom bricks and quietly pocketing the difference. Then came the justification for the lifestyle. We tracked the operational expenditures, specifically auditing the marketing and investor relations budgets. This was where my sister's glossy, curated brand violently intersected with the crime. The extravagant, highly publicized social events Bianca had been hosting over the past 18 months, the charity galas, the boutique openings, the exclusive winter tasting menus, were not the fruits of a legitimately successful husband. They were the very mechanism of the theft. Grant was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through those events, classifying the lavish catering, the designer wardrobes, the bespoke floral arrangements, and the top-tier venue rentals as legitimate marketing overhead and investor scouting fees. Bianca was not merely a trophy wife enjoying the spoils of a booming real estate empire. Her entire public persona was a heavily subsidized money laundering vehicle designed to legitimize stolen capital and blind the public. The rot, however, ran much deeper than my sister's vanity. As we pulled the private investor acquisition logs, analyzing the sources of the retail capital, a painfully familiar name kept appearing in the referral columns. Elena Ramirez. My mother. She was not the innocent, oblivious matriarch she pretended to be at the dinner table. She had been actively leveraging her social status at the country club, cornering wealthy, aging couples over afternoon tea and bridge games, selling them on the absolute exclusivity of Wintermere Exchange. She promised them guaranteed double-digit returns and priority selection for the luxury condominiums. In exchange for delivering these trusting retail investors to the slaughterhouse, my mother was quietly receiving substantial host fees, five-figure kickbacks wired directly into a secondary account she kept entirely separate from my father's knowledge. She had actively monetized her lifelong friendships to feed her son-in-law's scheme. My father, Raphael, was a completely different kind of tragedy. We finally located the exact collateral instrument tying his name to the project. It was a blanket personal guarantee, executed against the fully appraised value of my childhood home. He had essentially signed a blank check to a predator without bothering to read the fine print. The legal wording was absolute and merciless. If the Wintermere development defaulted, and it mathematically had to, given the staggering rate Grant was bleeding the capital dry, the creditors would not just take the empty commercial lots. They would instantly foreclose on my parents' estate to satisfy the outstanding debt. My father, blinded by his desperate, lifelong desire to be seen as a titan of high society real estate, had signed away his entire net worth without ever running the paperwork past independent legal counsel. He had bet the roof over his head on a rigged game, but the final discovery was the one that stopped my heart and turned the blood in my veins to liquid nitrogen. It happened at 2 a.m. on the 28th of December. I was reviewing the regulatory compliance submissions Grant had sent to the Municipal Zoning Board. These were the highly sensitive documents required to bypass standard environmental and traffic impact studies. I opened a digital file labeled as a Community Support Declaration. It was a formal letter, printed on the official, watermarked letterhead of Alder and Crest Advisory. It vouched for the absolute integrity of the Wintermere project, explicitly stating that the development met all rigorous municipal compliance standards, posed zero risk to the historic district's infrastructure, and had been fully vetted by an independent party. At the bottom of the page, in dark blue ink, was my signature. Beneath it was my exact professional title, Senior Director of Municipal Compliance. Grant had not just stolen my family's money, he had stolen my identity. He had forged my signature to give his fraudulent empire the ironclad credibility of an independent, senior municipal auditor. The implications were apocalyptic. When this project inevitably collapsed, and the federal investigators descended to sift through the wreckage, that letter would be their primary exhibit. I would not be viewed as an innocent bystander or a victimized sister-in-law. To the authorities, I would be the corrupt compliance officer who willingly rubber-stamped a multi-million-dollar fraud. They would strip my professional license, destroy the flawless reputation I had spent over a decade building, and pursue severe criminal charges for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Grant had securely chained me to the steering wheel of a car he was driving straight off a cliff. Rowan sat beside me in the dim light of the office, his jaw set hard, waiting for my command. We had enough concrete evidence to call the federal authorities right then and there. We could have dialed the Financial Crimes Division, frozen every single account by sunrise, and ended the nightmare before the end of the year. The urge to strike immediately, to protect my freedom and neutralize the threat, was a primal scream in my head. But looking at the undeniable proof of my family's deep complicity, my mother's secret kickbacks, my sister's laundered vanity, my father's arrogant negligence, and Grant's absolute, sociopathic willingness to send me to federal prison just to protect his own skin, A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. Ending it quietly with a bureaucratic morning raid was far too merciful. It would allow them to play the victims, to claim ignorance, to hide behind the chaos of a sudden municipal shutdown. Grant had spent years building a massive stage of lies, and he had invited the entire elite tier of Chicago society to watch him take his final bow. He wanted an audience. He craved the spotlight more than he craved oxygen. I closed the forged document on my screen and looked at my husband. I told Rowan to stand down and keep the escrow traps perfectly primed, but entirely invisible. I would not dismantle Grant Holloway in the shadows of a Tuesday morning. I would let him put on his tailored tuxedo, gather his wealthy investors, and raise his expensive champagne to his imaginary empire. I would wait for his grand, opulent New Year's Eve gala. If my family wanted to destroy me for the sake of a beautiful lie, they were going to have to watch the truth burn their entire world to the ground in front of every single person they ever wanted to impress. The heavy envelope constructed from thick textured parchment arrived via private courier on the morning of the 29th of December. I slid my fingernail under the wax seal to reveal a heavy card stamped in blinding, arrogant gold foil. The ornate cursive lettering declared a single phrase: "Midnight at the Bellwether." It was an exclusive invitation to the soft launch and New Year's Eve gala for Wintermere Exchange. Scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock on the 31st of December. The sheer audacity radiating from the paper was palpable. It was not just an invitation, it was a physical manifestation of a man crowning himself king. Less than an hour after the courier drove away, my mobile phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. The screen displayed Bianca's name. I answered, bracing myself for the inevitable onslaught. Her voice poured through the speaker, dripping with the sickly sweet resonance of absolute untouchable victory. She had not called to inquire if I was attending. She had called to ensure I felt the full weight of her supposed triumph. She spent 10 solid minutes reciting the guest list as if reading from a sacred text. She boasted about the major institutional investors flying in from the eastern seaboard, the local real estate journalists she had personally courted over expensive lunches, and the endless parade of wealthy socialites who had practically begged her for a spot on the velvet rope. She wanted me to know exactly how massive her kingdom had become, and she took deep pleasure in reminding me that I was merely a reluctant peasant being allowed inside the castle walls. She ended the call by sharply advising me to purchase a decent dress, warning me not to embarrass the family in front of the metropolitan press. Immediately after Bianca disconnected, my mother called to deliver the absolute ultimatum. Elena did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or maternal warmth. Her tone was a solid steel rod. She ordered me to attend the gala. She demanded that I stop playing the victim, stop holding on to my petty grudges, and stand directly in front of the cameras to publicly endorse Grant's visionary project. If I refused to play the role of the supportive sister, she promised in a low, terrifying whisper that the family attorneys would file a petition to seize Marisol House on the morning of the 2nd of January. It was a crude, brutal shakedown, dressed up as a festive family obligation. My initial instinct was to drop the gold-embossed card straight into the paper shredder and lock my front door until the new year arrived. I walked down the hall into our secure home office and tossed the invitation onto Rowan's desk. I told him I had absolutely no intention of participating in their manic, fraudulent charade. Rowan did not reply immediately. He picked up the heavy card, his sharp eyes scanning the elegant typography. He did not look at the boastful guest list or the time of the champagne toast. His gaze locked entirely onto the venue, the Bellwether. A slow, dangerous realization shifted the harsh angles of his face. He turned to his encrypted terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up a secure municipal asset database. He typed in the legal name of the historic high-rise. He turned the monitor toward me. The Bellwether did not belong to Grant Holloway. The building was a sprawling, opulent relic of the 1920s, renowned for its brass fixtures and marble lobbies. But currently, it was sitting dead in the water, locked under a strict protective receivership mandate managed directly by Black Pine Trust. The previous property developer had defaulted a year ago after committing a series of catastrophic zoning and safety violations. The entire asset was legally frozen by a federal judge. Absolutely no one possessed the legal authority to open those doors, let alone host a massive commercial event inside those walls, without a final, signed approval from the primary receiver. Which meant Grant was not just throwing a lavish party to stroke his own ego, he was trespassing on a monumental scale. He was breaking into a federally monitored asset to throw a completely counterfeit gala. The logistical pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying, perfect precision. Grant was staging a massive theatrical production because he was running out of time and stolen money. He knew he lacked the actual construction permits, the safety clearances, and the legal ownership of the ground he was standing on. But his funding contracts contained a specific milestone clause. If he could fill that grand ballroom with wealthy investors, flash enough expensive champagne, and generate a tidal wave of social media coverage declaring the launch a massive operational success, he could use that optical illusion as proof of concept. He was using the stroke of midnight to trigger the ultimate multi-million-dollar disbursement of the escrow capital. He needed the event to look real enough to fool the automated clearinghouses, hoping the final injection of cash would hit his offshore accounts before the regulatory agencies reopened after the holiday weekend. Rowan set the gold invitation back onto the mahogany desk, his expression shifting from analytical to lethal. He proposed a vital modification to our timeline. He suggested that I accept the invitation and arrive exactly on time. He wanted me to walk into that historic building and let them firmly believe they had won the war. Meanwhile, he would delay his own arrival. He wanted to give Grant the entire evening to inflate his ego, to make his grand, sweeping speeches, and to firmly lock himself onto a pedestal built entirely of lies and stolen capital. Rowan would step into the room only when the clock was ticking down to the final minute, cutting the architect of this disaster down at his highest, most visible peak. Let him climb as high as possible, Rowan reasoned, so the fall would be absolutely fatal. The remaining 48 hours became an exercise in cold, clinical preparation. I was not getting ready for a New Year's Eve party. I was arming myself for a corporate execution. I sat alone at my dining table and methodically structured my ammunition. I synchronized the secure cloud backups containing every piece of evidence we had unearthed. The forged municipal letters bearing my stolen signature, the ghost contractor invoices, the illicit wire transfers flowing directly to my sister's vanity agency, and the secret kickback logs tying my mother to the retail investor fraud. I arranged the digital files in a specific, chronological sequence on my mobile phone, ensuring I could present them to a room full of people with zero hesitation and absolute clarity. I opened my secure voice recording application, configuring the settings to run silently in the background, accessible with a single, unnoticed swipe of my thumb against the screen. But the most crucial weapon in my arsenal required no technology at all. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the harsh overhead vanity lights, and stared directly at my reflection in the mirror. I had to entirely bury the senior auditor. I had to suppress the righteous, burning rage of a daughter who had been profoundly betrayed and a homeowner whose only sanctuary had been violently threatened. I practiced softening the hard line of my jaw. I dropped the tension in my shoulders. I worked to paint a look of quiet, defeated compliance across my features. I had to walk into the glittering ballroom of the Bellwether, looking exactly like the broken, jealous, and entirely submissive sister they all desperately needed me to be. I had to shrink myself down, fade into the expensive wallpaper, and become the absolute calmest person in a room full of people who had no idea they were already breathing underwater. The trap was set, the bait was placed, and the hunter was finally ready to step into the blind. I stepped through the massive brass doors of the Bellwether precisely at 9 o'clock on the evening of the 31st of December. I wore a minimalist, dark navy silk dress that fell straight to my ankles, completely devoid of the sequins, heavy lace, or desperate plunging necklines that characterized the aggressive glamour swallowing the room. The freezing Chicago wind at my back was immediately replaced by an oppressive, artificial heat. The grand marble lobby had been masterfully transformed into a sensory weapon. A 12-piece string quartet played a sweeping modern symphony from a raised wrought iron mezzanine. Waiters in pristine white coats circulated through the dense crowd with silver trays, while a towering 7-tier champagne pyramid anchored the exact center of the room. The lighting was meticulously calibrated, casting a warm, golden, and incredibly expensive glow over the guests. It was an environment specifically designed to intoxicate, to entirely blur the lines of logic, and to make every single person holding a crystal flute feel wealthy, untouchable, and invincible. I had barely surrendered my wool coat to the cloakroom attendant when Bianca materialized from the moving sea of guests. She was draped in a custom red velvet gown, a heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, undoubtedly paid for by the ghost contractors Rowan and I had tracked down just days prior. She flanked herself with 3 wealthy wives of local city aldermen, clearly her chosen audience for the kill. "Penelope," Bianca chimed, her voice pitched perfectly to cut through the swell of the classical music. "You actually made it. I am genuinely shocked. But tell me, where is your imaginary husband? Did he get stuck in holiday traffic, or did he turn back into a pumpkin right at 8 o'clock? The 3 women standing beside her let out a synchronized chorus of practiced, pitying laughs. Bianca turned to them, her eyes wide with a performative, theatrical sympathy. "My sister has such a vivid imagination. She told us all at Christmas dinner that she was secretly married to a billionaire financial manager. We just let her have her little fairy tales. It is much safer to just play along with her." I offered absolutely no defense. I did not flush with anger or attempt to correct her. I merely gave her a slow, even smile, plucking a glass of sparkling water from a passing silver tray. My utter lack of a reaction only fueled her manic sense of superiority. Finding no friction to spark her fire, she quickly spun away, pulling her wealthy audience toward the center of the ballroom to bask in the blinding glow of her stolen kingdom. Across the massive, echoing hall, Grant was holding court. He led a flock of mesmerized retail investors through the grand, vaulted arches. He swept his arm dramatically toward the ceiling, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestioned authority. He was actively claiming personal credit for every square inch of the majesty surrounding them. He boasted about how he had single-handedly fought the city council to preserve the historic masonry, how he had personally traveled to Europe to curate the imported Italian marble for the interior design, and how he had outmaneuvered massive corporate conglomerates to buy out this legendary building using nothing but his sheer, unyielding vision and financial bravery. But I did not see a restored architectural masterpiece. My professional training violently stripped away the gold foil, the heavy velvet drapery, and the champagne bubbles, leaving only the terrifying structural reality of an active federal crime scene. My eyes operated like a forensic scanner, meticulously sweeping the perimeter of the ballroom. Behind a towering, extravagant arrangement of white winter orchids, I spotted the municipal fire inspection tags on the main sprinkler valve. They were heavily taped over with black industrial adhesive because the system was completely dead. I walked slowly along the eastern wall and noticed that the heavy brass emergency exit doors lacked the mandatory panic release hardware. They were merely propped shut with small wooden wedges painted to match the baseboards. The elegant bronze wayfinding signs pointing toward the luxury residential suites in the Winter Garden were not bolted into the stone. They were temporary foam core props held up by double-sided tape. When I casually glanced down a restricted, dimly lit hallway toward the supposedly finished model condominium units, the heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, revealing stacks of uninstalled plumbing fixtures and heavy wooden crates still bearing the original international shipping labels. The Bellwether was not a functioning, permitted luxury property. It was a spectacular, highly flammable movie set built on rotting wood and desperation. As I stood near a marble pillar, silently observing a faux crystal chandelier swaying slightly from an improper ceiling mount, a young woman in a tailored black uniform nervously approached me. She held a digital tablet tight against her chest and looked entirely overwhelmed by the chaos of the evening. "Excuse me, "Are you Penelope Ramirez?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly over the loud hum of the crowd. "I am," I replied, keeping my tone gentle and non-threatening. She let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. "Thank God I found you, mister." Holloway told the operations team that his sister-in-law, the compliance director, was handling all the final sign-offs for the service corridors and the catering prep zones. The temporary electrical grid in the West Wing keeps tripping the main breaker, and the head chef is threatening to walk out into the snow. "Could you please just log your authorization code into the system so we can bypass the municipal safety lock?" Grant said you already agreed to push it through for us. My stomach instantly turned to lead. Grant had not merely forged a single piece of paper and mailed it to a remote zoning board. He had actively weaponized my name and my professional title to browbeat an entire staff of working-class event employees into violating fundamental, life-saving safety protocols. He was using me as a verbal human shield to keep his illegal party running, risking the physical lives of hundreds of people just to keep the lights on for his grand illusion. "I cannot authorize that," I told the terrified young woman, looking directly and firmly into her eyes. "Do not bypass any safety locks. If the grid fails, let it fail in the dark. It is not your responsibility to break the law." She blinked, clearly confused and visibly terrified of losing her job, but she gave a small nod and hurried away into the crowd. Before I could fully process the sheer, sociopathic magnitude of Grant's recklessness, a hand gently touched my arm. I turned to see an elderly couple, both dressed in impeccable conservative evening wear. I recognized them instantly from the photographs Rowan and I had pulled. They were retired public school teachers who had carefully managed their municipal pensions for 40 years, the exact demographic my mother actively targeted at her country club luncheons. "Penelope, dear, it is so incredibly wonderful to finally see you," the woman said, her eyes shining with genuine, misplaced warmth. "Your mother told us you would be here tonight. We just had to come over and thank you personally." "Thank me for what?" I asked, my voice dangerously hollow, bracing myself for the impact. The husband smiled warmly, adjusting his silk tie. "For giving us the absolute confidence to invest in Wintermere Exchange. We were terribly hesitant at first. Sinking the vast majority of our retirement into a real estate venture at our age is a frightening prospect. But when Grant showed us the official community support letter from Alder and Crest Advisory, and we saw your name right there at the bottom, well, we knew it had to be a secure haven. Elena always bragged about how strict you are with municipal regulations. Knowing you personally audited and approved the safety and viability of the project gave us the peace of mind to wire our funds." Every single word they spoke was a physical, jagged blade twisting in my chest. Grant had weaponized my professional integrity to steal the life savings of the elderly. My own mother had happily facilitated the slaughter for a kickback fee. These sweet, trusting people were standing inside an illegal, fire hazard building, drinking cheap champagne poured into expensive glasses, thanking me for ensuring their total financial ruin. The primal urge to grab them by the shoulders, to scream the truth at the top of my lungs, to order everyone to run toward the exits, was a violent storm rising in my throat, but I violently swallowed it down. If I caused a panic right now, Grant would easily slip away in the ensuing chaos. He would blame the failure on a disgruntled, mentally unstable family member and wire the stolen capital offshore before the police even arrived at the front steps. "I truly hope you enjoy your evening," I managed to say, my voice perfectly steady, my face an impenetrable mask of polite indifference. I watched them walk away, laughing together, completely oblivious to the steel trap currently clamping down on their ankles. I turned back toward the center of the massive room. Grant was standing near the champagne tower, raising his glass to the thunderous applause of the crowd, his smile blinding, his ego expanding to fill the massive, fraudulent space. I did not react. I did not flinch. I let the string quartet play. I let the wine flow. I let every single lie, every forged signature, every stolen dollar, and every arrogant laugh weave themselves together, forming a rope so incredibly thick and heavy that when the floor finally dropped out from beneath him, there would be absolutely no chance of survival. I navigated through the dense, glittering crowd toward the dimly lit western corridor, seeking a momentary reprieve from the suffocating heat of the ballroom. As I passed a set of heavy mahogany double doors leading into what was designated as a private VIP lounge, a hand shot out from the shadows. Long, manicured fingers clamped shut around my wrist with bruising force. Before I could pull away, I was violently yanked into the room. The heavy doors clicked shut, instantly muffling the soaring strings of the orchestra. The air inside the lounge was thick, smelling of stale cigar smoke and desperate sweat. Standing in front of me were my parents. They looked nothing like the confident, polished socialites who had hosted Christmas dinner just 6 days prior. My father's bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his face pale and slick with perspiration. My mother's perfectly coiffed hair was slightly frayed, her eyes wide and manic. There was no pretense of familial warmth. The grand, moralizing facade had completely evaporated. My father slammed a thick stack of legal papers onto the center of a glass coffee table. He shoved a heavy gold pen on top of it. "Sign it," he demanded, his voice a jagged, breathless rasp. "Sign it right now. Penelope." "We are out of time." I stepped closer, keeping my hands firmly at my sides. I looked down at the top sheet. It was an irrevocable deed of easement and an air rights transfer for Marisol House. I checked the date stamped at the top right corner. It was backdated to the 15th of November. "You are asking me to commit a felony," I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection. "This is a backdated instrument. Do not lecture us on the law," my mother hissed, stepping forward and invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseatingly strong. "We are in too deep. Do you understand that? Raphael pledged the house. I brought in half the country club. If this project does not clear its final regulatory hurdles by midnight, the escrow will permanently lock. The creditors will seize everything. You are going to sign that paper, transfer the alleyway access, and save this family." They were no longer asking for a favor. They were demanding I throw myself onto a grenade they had willingly unpinned. Before I could formulate a response, the side door connecting the lounge to the catering prep area swung open. Bianca marched in, her red velvet gown swishing against the plush carpet. She did not look panicked like our parents. She looked cold, calculated, and violently annoyed. "Stop acting like a martyr, Penelope," Bianca snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "Just pick up the pen." I turned my gaze to my younger sister. "You knew," I said softly. "You knew he forged my signature on the municipal compliance letters." Bianca did not flinch. She held my stare with absolute, terrifying emptiness. "I found out after he submitted them. What was I supposed to do? Call the police on my own husband? Burn down our entire life over a stupid zoning letter? An opportunity to build generational wealth like this only comes around once. Grant did what he had to do to push the paperwork through the red tape. If you had just been cooperative from the beginning, he would not have needed to use your name." She was actively blaming me for her husband's identity theft. The sheer, breathtaking narcissism of her justification solidified the ice in my veins. The main doors to the lounge opened again. Grant stepped inside. He casually reached behind him and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, sealing the 5 of us inside the soundproof room. He had completely dropped the charismatic, visionary persona he was wearing out in the ballroom. His eyes were dark, flat, and predatory. He walked slowly toward the glass table, picked up the gold pen, and held it out to me. "The party is almost over, Penelope," Grant said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "You have exactly 45 minutes until midnight. I need that easement filed into the digital registry before the final disbursement algorithm sweeps the system. If you do not sign that document right here, right now, I am going to ruin you." "You have already tried," I replied, keeping my hands clasped together to hide the fact that I was subtly sliding my thumb across the screen of my mobile phone, activating the secure voice recorder inside my clutch purse. I have not even started, Grant sneered, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. If you blow this deal up, I will go straight to the Metropolitan Press tomorrow morning. I will spin a very convincing narrative about a bitter, jealous municipal auditor who abused her industry connections to systematically sabotage a young developer's minority-funded project. I will bury you in so many civil defamation lawsuits you will be spending your retirement defending yourself. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the glass table, cornering me. And do not think you can run to the regulatory agencies. Do you really think I am stupid enough to leave my fingerprints on the blast radius? By the time the official municipal audits begin next month, the capital will have already cycled through 3 different offshore holding companies. The assets will be legally transferred to blind trusts. I will be completely untouchable, but you know whose name is sitting in the municipal archives, bright as day, endorsing the structural integrity of this entire operation? Yours. He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. When the feds come looking for someone to blame for the missing millions, they are going to look at the senior compliance director who rubber-stamped the safety protocols. You will be the prime suspect, Penelope. You will lose your license, your career, and your freedom, all because you wanted to stubbornly cling to a rotting brick bakery. My parents stood silently in the background, watching a man threaten to send their eldest daughter to federal prison, and they did absolutely nothing to stop him. They merely waited with bated breath, hoping his extortion would successfully force me to sign. I kept my voice incredibly soft, projecting a facade of terrified submission. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to dig the grave so deep he could never climb out. You cannot just take my property, I whispered, injecting a slight tremble into my vocal cords. Even with an easement, the zoning board would never approve a commercial waste overlay right against a residential structure. Grant rolled his eyes, utterly bloated by his own perceived brilliance. You really are naive. I already solved that problem. I submitted the amended hospitality overlay and the valet parking schematics to the planning committee weeks ago. I hard-coded the physical address of Marisol House directly into the service sector footprint before Thanksgiving. The board already pre-approved the land use based on the assumption that the acquisition was a done deal. I owned your property on paper long before you ever sat down at that Christmas dinner. The recorder in my purse silently captured every single syllable. He had just confessed to premeditated fraud. He had admitted to manipulating municipal zoning maps using property he did not legally own, weeks before he ever presented the community alignment packet to me. He had just handed me the final, irrefutable puzzle piece proving absolute malicious intent. I looked at the backdated contract on the table. I looked at my father, who had mortgaged his soul. I looked at my mother, who had sold her friends. I looked at my sister, who had traded her conscience for velvet and diamonds. And finally, I looked at the arrogant thief who thought he had outsmarted everyone. Up until this exact second, a microscopic, pathetic fraction of my heart had still hoped they would suddenly realize the horror of what they were doing and stop. But hearing Grant boast about his crimes, watching my family actively endorse my destruction, that final sliver of hope completely died, and in its place, an absolute, terrifying calm took over. I no longer wanted them to stop. I wanted them to keep talking. I wanted them to feel so incredibly victorious, so completely invincible, that they would never see the executioner's blade until it was already slicing through their necks. I did not reach for the pen. I simply looked at Grant, letting the silence stretch until the ambient hum of the ventilation system felt deafening. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, dropping the trembling act entirely, my voice returning to its natural, razor-sharp baseline. Grant frowned, clearly unsettled by the sudden shift in my demeanor. Before he could formulate another threat, I turned my back on him, walked over to the heavy brass deadbolt, and unlocked the door. I stepped out of the stifling room and back into the glittering, doomed ballroom, leaving them to their desperate delusions for just a few minutes longer. At exactly 11:45 on the evening of the 31st of December, the sweeping orchestral music faded into a rhythmic, pulsing electronic beat. The master of ceremonies, a minor local television personality hired for the night, urged all remaining guests to move from the peripheral lounges and hallways into the central ballroom. It was time for the grand crescendo. Waiters in pristine white coats materialized from the shadows, pressing fresh crystal flutes of vintage champagne into every available hand. The overhead chandeliers dimmed, and a massive, towering digital screen at the front of the room flared to life, casting an icy blue light over the hundreds of faces turned toward the stage. Grant strode up the carpeted steps to the podium, perfectly silhouetted against the glowing logo of Wintermere Exchange. The applause was deafening, a roaring wave of validation from the city's elite, the local press, and the retail investors who had unknowingly mortgaged their futures to be in this room. He raised both hands, soaking in the adulation like a man dying of thirst. He waited for the silence to stretch, ensuring every single eye was locked onto him. When he finally spoke, his voice was a masterclass in practiced charisma, deep and echoing through the state-of-the-art acoustic system. "Tonight, we do not just turn the page on a calendar," Grant proclaimed, gripping the edges of the podium. "We unlock the future of this magnificent city. We take a forgotten, crumbling district and breathe life, luxury, and legacy back into its bones." He extended his right arm toward the front row. "And no king can build an empire without his queen. I want to bring up the woman whose flawless taste and tireless dedication made this vision a reality. My brilliant wife, Bianca." Bianca glided up the stairs, the red velvet of her gown trailing behind her like royalty. She took her place beside him, flashing a blinding, camera-ready smile as the photographers in the press pit snapped frantically. She looked exactly like the billionaire socialite she had always hallucinated herself to be. But Grant was not finished. His eyes scanned the front rows, locking directly onto me where I stood near the edge of the VIP section. Having failed to break me in the private lounge, he had decided to execute his final contingency plan: public humiliation. If he could frame me as a jealous, unstable pariah in front of his investors right now, any future whistleblowing on my part would look like a pathetic, fabricated vendetta. "Building a legacy requires absolute ruthlessness," Grant continued, his tone shifting from inspirational to a sharp, patronizing mock sympathy. "It means leaving the past behind. Some people cannot handle that kind of momentum. My sister-in-law is here tonight. She has spent her entire life stuck in a dusty, irrelevant corner of the municipal bureaucracy, clutching a crumbling brick building because she has absolutely nothing else to show for her 32 years on this earth. She has tried at every turn to halt our progress out of sheer, bitter envy, but tonight proves that genuine vision will always crush mediocrity." The crowd murmured, an ugly, uncomfortable sound. Dozens of heads turned in my direction, eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disdain. Bianca leaned into the microphone, adding a sharp, breathless laugh. "We still love you, Penelope, even if you are entirely alone in the world." At exactly 10 minutes to midnight, the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, heavy thud that completely bypassed the microphone's amplification. A man stepped across the threshold. He wore a tailored, midnight blue tuxedo that absorbed the ambient light, completely devoid of any flashy accessories. It was Rowan. He did not rush. He did not look at the crowd. He simply walked down the central aisle with the terrifying, unhurried precision of an apex predator entering a cage full of frightened birds. He possessed a silent, gravitational power that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. People who had absolutely no idea who he was instinctively stepped back, clearing a path, their champagne flutes lowering as a profound, heavy silence rippled forward from the back of the hall to the front stage. My parents, standing a few feet away from me, exchanged a look of pure, dismissive amusement. My father whispered loudly to a neighboring alderman's wife that I must have hired a theatrical escort from a high-end agency just to save face. Bianca, standing on the stage, visibly rolled her eyes. She leaned back into the microphone, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Oh, look everyone, the imaginary husband finally materialized. Did you rent him by the hour?" Penelope? Or did you pay for the full holiday package?" Rowan ignored the taunt entirely. He reached my side, slipping his hand seamlessly into mine. The warmth and solid weight of his grip anchored me to the marble floor. He looked up at the stage, his expression entirely blank, waiting for Grant to make his final, fatal move. Grant sneered, clearly threatened by the sudden shift in the room's energy, but far too arrogant to recognize the imminent danger. He puffed out his chest, projecting his voice to regain total control of his audience. "Let them have their little show. It changes absolutely nothing. In exactly 5 minutes, the final regulatory locks disengage. I have the entire institutional backing of Black Pine Trust sitting right in my pocket. I hold all the doors to this project. I can call the managing partner of the escrow fund right now and have $50 million transferred before the confetti even hits the ground." I stepped forward, releasing Rowan's hand. I did not raise my voice, but the dead silence of the ballroom carried my words perfectly to the stage. "Then do it, Grant." Grant froze, his hand hovering over the podium tablet. "You have hundreds of investors in this room," I continued, my tone clinical, polite, and completely lethal. "You have the Metropolitan Press, you have my family, who pledged their entire estate to your vision. If you hold all the doors, there's no need to wait for an automated sweep at midnight. Do the simplest thing in the world to end all the miserable, bitter doubts you claim I have. The central screen behind you is mirrored to your presentation tablet. Log into the direct disbursement dashboard right now. Show every single person in this room that the capital is secure." The atmosphere in the ballroom instantly turned to lead. The retail investors, the ones who had staked their life savings and municipal pensions on his golden promises, immediately leaned forward. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. It was an entirely reasonable demand from a corporate compliance director. If the money was truly there, showing the digital ledger was the ultimate, irrefutable victory lap. Grant stared at me, a microscopic flicker of genuine panic finally piercing his heavily polished facade. But he was completely trapped. The cameras were rolling. The wealthy elite were watching his every move. If he backed down now, if he refused to show the screen, the illusion of his absolute power would shatter instantly. He swallowed hard, nervously adjusting his silk tie. His ego, engorged by years of unchallenged fraud and blind familial worship, whispered the final, fatal lie into his ear. He believed the stolen authorization codes his assistant had cloned would actually work. He truly believed he was smart enough to force the lock in front of a live audience. "Gladly," Grant snapped, his voice tight and defensive. He turned his back to the silent crowd, stepped directly up to the podium tablet, and placed his fingers firmly on the digital interface, entirely convinced he was about to prove his unquestionable supremacy to the world. He had absolutely no idea he was pressing his own hand directly onto the button that would drop the floor out from beneath him. Grant confidently typed his credentials into the podium tablet. He hit the enter key with a theatrical flourish, turning to face the crowd with a smug, expectant grin. He was entirely convinced he was about to prove his unquestionable supremacy. But the triumphant chime he anticipated never came. Instead, the massive digital projection screen spanning the wall behind him glitched violently. The glossy Wintermere Exchange logo dissolved into a stark, high-contrast terminal window. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red, then stabilized into a secure corporate dashboard bearing the undeniable, heavy crest of Black Pine Trust. At the center of the screen, in bold, massive lettering, the system displayed a total account freeze. Right below that, the authorized administrator profile loaded for the entire room to see: Rowan Mercer, managing partner. The collective breath of the entire ballroom hitched. The silence was absolute, sudden, and suffocating. Rowan stepped forward, his voice a low, commanding baritone that effortlessly dominated the massive space without the need for a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone devoid of any theatricality, purely administrative and completely devastating. "This entire evening is an unauthorized, illegal trespass. The bellwether is currently under a strict federal protective receivership mandate managed by my firm. Every single operational disbursement associated with Wintermere Exchange has been permanently frozen. The system access Mr. Holloway just attempted to utilize is a stolen, illegally cloned credential. Grant's face drained of all color, transforming from a flushed, arrogant king into a terrified ghost in the span of a single heartbeat. I walked up the carpeted steps of the stage, standing shoulder to shoulder with my husband. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the undeniable weight of the evidence do the cutting. The project you have all invested in is a mirage, I told the sea of pale, shocked faces. The community support letter bearing my signature and my professional compliance title was entirely forged by Grant to bypass municipal scrutiny. The restoration budget was actively siphoned through a massive network of ghost contractors. I turned my head and looked directly at my sister. A substantial portion of that stolen capital was routed directly into a private media agency owned and operated by Bianca, disguised as branding consultation fees. Bianca staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth as the surrounding aldermen's wives physically recoiled from her, treating her like a sudden contagion. I shifted my gaze to my parents standing frozen in the front row. My mother, Elena, received 5-figure kickbacks for actively recruiting retail investors at her country club, pulling her own friends into a financial slaughterhouse. And my father, Raphael, executed a blanket personal guarantee against his own estate, pledging the roof over his head to a man who was simultaneously attempting to steal my grandmother's property with a backdated, fraudulent easement. The panic in the room finally broke through the silence. Wealthy investors dropped their expensive crystal flutes, the glass shattering sharply against the marble floor. The horrifying truth washed over the crowd. The building permits were non-existent. The operational safety conditions were never met. The subscription numbers were wildly inflated, and this lavish, champagne-soaked gala was nothing more than a desperate, theatrical prop designed to trick an automated clearinghouse into releasing the final wave of escrow capital. Grant snapped. He lunged toward the microphone, his polished veneer entirely shattered. "She is lying!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger at Bianca. "She knew about the money. It was her agency!" Then he spun wildly toward me, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "You set me up. Penelope, you frame me because you are a bitter, jealous sociopath." I did not argue with a dying man. I simply reached into my clutch, pulled out my mobile phone, and pressed play on the audio file I had recorded less than an hour ago in the VIP lounge. The pristine acoustic system of the ballroom amplified Grant's own recorded voice with terrifying, inescapable clarity. I hard-coded the physical address of Marisol House directly into the service sector footprint before Thanksgiving. The board already pre-approved the land use based on the assumption that the acquisition was a done deal. I owned your property on paper long before you ever sat down at that Christmas dinner. His own arrogant confession echoed against the vaulted ceilings, hanging in the air like a heavy steel blade. Before Grant could even open his mouth to form another useless lie, the heavy brass doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash. They were not guests arriving late for the countdown. A highly coordinated wave of personnel flooded the room, court-ordered enforcement officers, building receivership administrators, and financial crime investigators moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. They marched down the center aisle carrying asset freeze orders, digital data seizure warrants, and a formal legal mandate immediately terminating the event for severe operational and safety violations. The collapse of the Ramirez family happened in real time, right there under the blazing chandeliers. Bianca sank to her knees, the heavy velvet of her gown pooling around her as she finally understood that her entire glamorous brand was built on stolen, dirty money, and she was now a primary accessory to federal wire fraud. Elena stood completely paralyzed, the blood draining from her face as she realized the secret broker fees she so greedily accepted had transformed her from a wealthy socialite into a complicit link in a criminal chain. Raphael leaned heavily against a marble pillar, gasping for air. the devastating reality finally crushing his chest. He had willingly surrendered his actual, paid-off home for a completely fabricated dream. I did not offer them a lifeline. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in a triumphant shout. I simply walked down the stairs, approached my father, and handed him a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was a formal notification that Marisol House had been irrevocably transferred into an impenetrable protective trust. Any future communication regarding me or my property will be routed exclusively through my legal counsel, I told him, my voice carrying the absolute final coldness of a closed grave. The era of my family using me as their convenient prey, their punching bag, and their silent victim ended precisely as the grand clock in the lobby began to chime, signaling the arrival of the new year. The final image burned into my memory as Rowan and I walked out of the building was the massive digital screen behind the stage. The festive countdown clock had been completely overridden, replaced by a stark, flashing red notification of a federal asset freeze. The room, which only minutes prior had been a golden, opulent monument to high society success, had instantly transformed into a chaotic, terrifying crime scene where unchecked greed was violently eating itself alive. In the months that followed the spectacular collapse of Wintermere Exchange, the dust settled exactly as I had designed. Grant faced a mountain of federal indictments for wire fraud and forgery. My parents lost their sprawling suburban estate to the creditors and were forced to relocate to a tiny rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. Bianca's social empire evaporated overnight, leaving her facing grueling legal depositions and the terrifying reality of a life without a limitless credit card. As for me, I kept my grandmother's legacy exactly where it belonged. I renovated the ground floor of Marisol House, replacing the old bakery counters with solid oak desks and secure filing cabinets. I transformed the space into a dedicated legal and financial advocacy center, providing free, aggressive compliance support for women who were being financially manipulated or coerced out of their assets by toxic family members. My final act of revenge was not merely about destroying the people who tried to bury me. It was about taking the broken, shattered bricks they left behind and building a fortress of genuine, undeniable strength. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening to this story from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it even more by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.